opportunities and 12% of stock social housing, 99 relets a year. And a reliance on the private rented sector, which is not affordable, requiring those on even a median income to pay a median rent, lose homes and at least 40% of their income. So is this the London Borough? It's the London Borough of Purbeck in Dorset. And I think the important thing to pick out is actually, I think, that quite a lot of those characteristics will also ring true to the sort of housing circumstances that you experience in London. And that's not the only similarity. The other is this increasing interest in community-led housing as a way of communities finding a way of meeting their particular housing needs. And it was on the back of that that I was asked to put together a guide for planners, because the experience was that going around and trying to promote community-led housing, sitting in a room with a group of planners and they go, well, what is community-led housing? Well, what's that got to do with us? Well, hopefully the guide will encourage planners, of which I am one, to get more involved in community-led housing, because actually the planner's role is absolutely critical. So I'm going to try in a very short period of time to canter through literally the high points that are in the guide. I hope that it will give you some ideas of policy and practice that have worked or are evolving. I think that's a really important point to make, is that it is an evolving area of policy. And perhaps also to pick up some of the learning points which have come out of that practice and policy which has already been adopted. So the first question is, well, why? Why should planners get involved in community-led housing? Well, I think the first is that actually it's very critical and can be a really important way in which planners can achieve some of the things which are expected of them by the NPPA. So, the first, that there's sustainable development. Most community-led housing schemes will have social benefit, both through the housing and through the involvement of the community, building social skills, confidence in communities. There'll be economic benefits, locally, often employing local businesses to do the development. Some of them will also provide workspace, and a lot of them will be developed with very high environmental standard housing, but will also provide green space, public open space, allotments, etc. If that isn't sustainable development in practice, I'm not sure that I know what is. They're obviously a way of meeting housing need, and that's across a range of tenures and types of housing. I think the other thing which is interesting and something which is becoming much more apparent is just how community-led housing can help local planning authorities meet that statutory requirement to provide sites for people on their self and custom build register. And I'll come back to that in a little while, because actually community-led housing can fall within that definition of self and custom building. And I think the other is, this is a community-led housing is participatory. It's a participatory exercise, and as such, it is a way in which local planning authorities can take part in that early engagement with communities to bring sites forward to improve the outcomes for the community. And on the other side of the coin, communities will need planners because they need sites. They need sites at the right price, which I know is going to come up again in discussions and other presentations. They need a process which is smooth, quick, clear, because like any developer, they need to avoid the risks and delay which brings costs. And they need planning to be able to support them to make sure that the homes that they do build are available to meet the needs of their community. So which sort of brings us on to the definition. And the Self and Custom Built Housing Building Act, strange wording, I think, but anyway, does include these criteria in what is self and custom built house building. And B and C immediately lend themselves to development by community land trust or co-housing scheme, co-op, self-help, PMOs. So as such, it's possible that self and custom building definition can be used to underpin planning policy. The other approach which has been used is to use the criteria which are in the Community Housing Fund, and these are the three criteria there, which are there. Also used in some local plans to underpin policy wording around community-led housing. But actually, any of those types of community-led housing that I mentioned will be expected to meet those three. So there's a fairly sound basis on which to base policy for community-led housing. But what is its status? And the question here is it a process for development or is it a form of development? And actually planning authorities have taken both approaches, and I'll go through them as we go through the presentation. The most common approach is that it is a process, and as such, community-led housing is threaded through different policies within the local plan. Where it's a form of development, it could be that community-led housing becomes part of the self and custom build policy, or, and I only know of 2 examples where this has happened, there are specific policies for community-led development. So looking at the first one, about stitching it into self and custom build, the important point about the policy is that it does in some way have to link this back to community-led housing. The example I've chosen to illustrate that is the one for York City Council, which is summarised basically there in the box. The key point is that in the supporting text, it actually specifically and explicitly states that self and custom building can be community-led projects where the community organises the construction work. So immediately you've got that link. The other strength of the policy is that it has recognised the importance of bringing sites forward at a competitive price in order for them to develop through the self and custom build route. So already looking at how do you keep the land value down to make sure that it's viable for a community-led organisation to provide the type of housing its community needs. The example on this side is Your Space, which is a development which has already got planning permission on the back of this policy. It's a co-housing scheme on a large publicly owned site, a site actually owned by, was owned by York City Council, which provide 19 plots of affordable housing in the form of mutual home ownership, but also with some of those other communal benefits, which are kitchen, dining space. The strength of the York policy is that one about building in community-led housing as part of self and custom build. It's applicable to all types of sites, whether they're public or private, green or brownfield. Looking at could it be strengthened? Well, yes, it probably could, and that might be by incorporating the wording community-led housing actually into the policy, and actually lowering the site threshold. You know, that is quite high, 5 hectares, that's a big site actually. Could you do it on a much smaller site? And I think, yes, you could. The issue, of course, will be the NPPF definition of what's appropriate threshold to secure affordable housing. That's my hobby horse, I'm not going to go into it today. The other is whether you could extend the policy to cover not just new build in terms of the community group doing the new build, but actually buying properties off the shelf. Interestingly, the latest application of the policy has been to development of apartments where the plots have been agreed as being apartments rather than development plots, and that's been a real advance and actually really important in somewhere like York and I suspect London as well. Then the other stream is to thread it through generic policies, and I've taken a number of examples. I think the first one, which I don't apologise that this is rural, it's Cornwall, but Cornwall has really been at the vanguard of pushing community at the heart of policy. And whereas a lot of plans that I read do talk about, community involved and getting community benefits and making sure that we advocate for the community, they're all there in the text, but few of them actually put that into policy, and certainly not into the strategic spatial policy which Cornwall has done. And 3 schemes there actually are different forms of community-led housing which have been developed through Cornwall Community Land Trust. And then I picked up the draft New London Plan policy, which explicitly talks about bringing forward land for self and custom built housing, with which you'll be familiar. And I think what's interesting about this policy, and talking to one of the case studies which is in the guide, is that it isn't just that policy, but it's all the other policies that sit behind that. So it's this policy, plus the approach to affordable housing, plus the mayoral goals for affordable housing, plus the funding which is for community housing specifically for London. So all those things come together. The learning point being it can't just be one policy which will deliver community-led housing if you're going to thread it through the local plan. The concern has been whether, I understand, is that whether that means that there will be a pressure on really small, little plots of green space, whether they're gardens or small pocket parks. A thought which occurred to me was actually, could you then maybe look at that as some sort of exception site route? So you say these sites will be protected unless they're going to provide housing led as or provided as a community-led housing. And there's a precedent for that in the rural exception site policy, which is basically aiming for the same outcome. The new thing which came into the NPPF is the entry-level exception sites, which may or may not work for community-led housing. There's a question of balancing the policy which talks about meeting a need across the local authority area and the community-led groups requirements that the housing should meet the needs of its defined community. But again, there are ways of getting around that, maybe having a cascade where you start with the community and spilling that out to the wider local authority if properties aren't taken up. The specific policy, as I say, there are two examples where community-led development is written as a specific policy. One is Test Valley in Hampshire, but the more comprehensive one is East Cambridgeshire, and again, the principles of the policy are set out there in the box. The key thing, again, was that what they have tried to do is use the policy to try and depress land value to various extents. This policy has currently delivered 119 market houses and 41 affordable housing, and 5 schemes in the pipeline. And one of the examples is this one here, which is Streatham and Wilburton. It's a site of 75 homes, so it's a bit like a Section 106 site, but it's developed as a joint venture where the Community Land Trust is one of the partners of that joint venture. Again, providing not just homes for people with a local connection, but other social, economic and environmental benefits. East Cambridgeshire then decided, because they so like this policy and there was such great strength of political support behind it, that they put a new policy forward in the examination, and I think it's quite salutary what happened to it. In the draft policy, it talked about giving a presumption in favour of development for community-led schemes. And not surprisingly, private developers and actually housing associations as well were very unhappy about that, and it did get thrown out at examination. I think the learning point from that is that if you're going to put in a policy on community-led housing, it has to be that that is one of the mechanisms for delivering and not the only one. But having it there explicitly mentioned as one of the options means that you're not just reliant on private developer or registered providers to deliver housing. And then the next question, well, is community-led housing affordable housing? And the answer is, well, in planning terms, yes and no. And that's, in a way, one of the strengths. So yes, it can provide social rent, affordable rent, and the dominance is for that to be the main tenure of community-led housing schemes. But it can also provide market housing. So if it's a community of interest, say a group of older people who are looking to downsize, actually it might be that then that does become market housing, but with a covenant that requires that it always goes to people of a certain age group. The challenge is now in the NPPF. So the revised glossary, which goes through the definitions of what is affordable housing, which requires that the landlord of affordable rented housing is a registered provider. Now, a lot of community-led housing groups will also be a registered provider, particularly if they're drawing down grant from Homes England or UNCHF, I imagine. But not all of them are, and some of them won't be because they're small. And actually registering is a big step for them, and do they really want to go down that route? We took some legal advice and also had a discussion with MHCLG about, well, you know, does it really have to be that you have to be a registered provider to be affordable rent? And given that the NPPF is just a material consideration, it's not statutory, There is no statutory definition of affordable housing yet. Then there is room for manoeuvre. The drive for the policy in the NPPF is obviously the problems that occurred with Grenfell over poor quality management. And actually it should be that it doesn't matter who the landlord is, any tenant should be able to be assured that they will have quality management and maintenance of their properties. Leeds City Council had already started to think about, well, how do we ensure that we have that diversity of providers delivering affordable housing, and had already come up with a way through their section 106 in which they opened the door to other developers making that provision. They become a signatory, or they can become a signatory of the section 106. Section 106 specifically says that the affordable housing can be provided by another body, but the other body has to go through the process of approval with sign agreement from the council. Leeds City Council say they're going to continue with that policy even despite the political. Oh my goodness, we're over time. Right, okay, so then most explicitly to deliver community-led housing is Arran District Council. Again, not in policy but in supporting text, but clearly and explicitly states that CRTs can be one provider of community-led housing. Which sort of brings us on to the issue of viability. Important for any affordable housing scheme that there are some additional considerations when looking at community-led housing schemes, and they're listed in the box. Your income is likely to be less, costs can be higher, net development site is likely to be smaller, particularly if you've got other community benefits. And again, two examples of responses to that. So York City Council, in disposing of its sites, has already put into the methodology that the land valuation should take account of the higher costs of community-led housing development. And Cambridge local plan, which actually this isn't particularly new, but sets the transfer price and says in policy that it will set the transfer price of affordable housing going from developer to housing association. And again, Cambridge as well recognised community-led housing as a provider of affordable housing. Local lettings, again, as mentioned earlier, communities there to deliver the housing for their community. And that will be in their memorandum articles of legal incorporation, and it will define what that community is. So section 106 can include those things within it by the name of the organisation, the qualifying criteria. And I think the interesting bit is including a local lettings plan as an addendum to the section 106. And that is standard policy in a number of areas, and one is West Dorset, where they have a template for section 106s, and at the bottom here you'll see how they have built in being able to be flexible to the particular needs of allocating properties to people who are receiving homes through a community land trust. Key learning points, I'm going to jump that because we've sort of gone through, I've only got a few minutes left. And moving on to development management, and it's such an important point this, that the community needs to be confident and have the confidence to take the scheme forward. And development managers have a key role in supporting communities to get that. And there are a number of places where they can, where that interaction with development is so important, and I've listed them here in green. The bottom line is that this is participative, so development managers participate. You have, or they have, you have immense expertise, which isn't within the gift or the capacity of those communities yet, but you're able to offer advice and actually solutions which get around some of the problems which they might face, which are challenges, but actually find a way of collaboration. Right, and then there are a list of things where we've talked about what a community needs from development managers, but what do development managers need from communities, and I've listed them here. The key is that you've also got the evidence, and the community knows what evidence is needed in order to meet those criteria. And ideally, you'd put those into a section 106, into a supplementary planning document.